Well, hello everyone. Welcome to American TESOL Presents Free Friday webinars. We're here every other Friday talking about various different topics for English language teachers, how to integrate technology, different pedagogy, and ways to engage their learners. I'm your hostess, Shelly Sanchez-Terrell, and you can find today's resources at shellyterrell.com/webinar. You can go to americantsol.com and find several different courses. We have teaching young learners, we have TESOL Advanced, teaching business English, and also teaching ESL with technology, all which you can do a certification. You can get a certification. And we have face-to-face classes as well as online classes. And part of the online learning are these webinars. So that's why we do offer them for free. And we also have recordings on our YouTube channel. Today, we're going to talk about how you can use webinars to engage your learners. So many of us either have where we do a blended learning situation, and sometimes we have an LMS, a learning management system, such as Canva, Schoology, or any other type of Edmodo or something like that, where we have some of our teaching face-to-face and some of our teaching where it's online. And some of us might actually just teach online. There are several English language teachers who will teach through Skype or some other online platforms as well. And webinars can be a really great way to be able to engage learners and to also be able to show the content in more dynamic visual ways. We'll get more to the benefits of teaching with webinars. But I think it's really, really important when we are talking about webinars, we definitely are going to talk about the design. Some of my presentations are really well prepared. The visuals you'll see are really strong. I try to use very few words. Um, Not all of them as perfect as I would like them to be, only because I probably present maybe 100 to 200 times online, definitely a year. So I do a lot of online training, and so I don't get to spend as much time with my presentations as I'd like. But hopefully you can see in this presentation some of the tips that I plan on sharing with you. Especially with language learners, I think it's really important when you are teaching online, as students, definitely the visual is so important. So it's important that our images reflect what we're saying, or they catch the attention of our learners, because their eyes process the information first before they actually get to see the words or get to learn what's on the actual presentation. So I think it's really, really important, not only that it's designed well, but also I really like where he says demonstrate it and then link to an activity. In other words, get them to use the important points and information in an important way to increase their understanding of it. So why would we use webinars? Well, there are several reasons why, but one of the reasons that I think are really important. First of all, it's a really great way to get to know the professor or the teacher. With webinars, your students are able to see your personality. They're often able to see you on video. They're able to hear your voice. If you only teach online, then it's so important that there's a way for them to be able to speak with you live. And so webinars give you that opportunity. Often when you have an online course, you might have several videos of you talking, presenting, and that's great because they get to see you. But with webinars, it's live, it's right there. They get to ask you questions, and so they definitely do get to know you. And over here, you can kind of see the elements. Now, for the purpose here, I'm going to use, of course, our webinar platform. So you're going to see that looks very similar to what you're looking at right now. It might be a little surreal. But we do use Adobe Connect, and I'll mention some different webinar platforms. I don't have any slides with screenshots or anything. One, because these platforms can be very, very expensive. So it depends on what your institution has you use. Another reason why is because when you are using a webinar platform, some of the free ones that are available, and a lot of these have different types of ways you can use them free. For example, I think Adobe Connect has an option where you get so many weeks or a month or a limited time where you get to use the platform free. And some of the other ones, even though they are free, it's I don't necessarily think they're the best platforms. So for this intent and purposes, we will use Adobe Connect. Now, many of the platforms have very similar features. So as you can see here, ways that they get to know you and ways that they get to know their peers. They get to see a picture of you, or they get to hear your voice, or they get to see you on webcam. The other great part is that they get to chat through with their peers, and they get to know them that way. Like each of you is chatting with each other from all over the world, so you get to know each other. If you come regularly, then you really do feel like you know more about that person. The other part are there other features. For example, participants or students would be able to speak with you. You can allow them to use the mic. You can allow them to use their webcam. And these are some of the things that I do with my students when I do teach with the webinar platform. Is I do give them a choice if they feel comfortable to be able to speak on the microphone, ask a question, but they're not required to. The other reason why it's great to use webinars is because you can present your content live and really show different ways to make that content come alive. So for example, I could show you a video within this platform. I could get you to draw, to complete a graphic organizer. We'll look at engagement a little bit later, but there's definitely ways you can have, you can definitely play something. So just 2 days ago when I was using webinars with my college students, one of the tasks we did was listen to 3 minutes of a podcast, and then there was a way for them to be able to answer questions together and us discuss that podcast. So you can present the content in several ways, and there's also lots of ways for students to interact. And so one of the features I used with my students recently, because there was a question about whether they agreed with what was said in the podcast. And this is even something you can test out right now. We don't usually do this very often, but if you go to the top and you see this little man with his hand raised, if you click on the arrow next to it, then you can choose agree, disagree, and there's laughter, slow down, speed up. So there's a lot of ways that you're able to interact. So I could ask you a question. Do you agree that webinars are a great way to engage learners? And you can right now choose whether you agree or disagree. And then, and Peggy's laughing about this. And the great thing is that it comes on the side, and then you're able to see quickly, what your peers believe as well. So a lot of different webinar platforms have the similar features. You just have to get to know your platform to see ways that you can get your students to, to engage students and to get their feedback throughout. There's also that back channel, which for us, it's the chat box, and That's a great way. You can also, of course, have a hashtag and then or carry it on your learning management system. Perhaps you followed up there. So, but I think the chat box is a really great way to be able to get students to have a back channel. What I usually do is I'll copy that back channel chat and then I'll send it to all the students. I make it readily available with the slides. We saw at the beginning that quote, it really talked about the visual elements, and that's really important with the webinar. One of the reasons why I think it was about 7 years ago, I got hired by American TESOL to host these webinars is because they saw the design of my slides and the way that I present. The reason was because, and when you tend to look at some teachers presenting, a lot of times what happens is they'll put tons of words on a slide or put a lot of research, and that's not what a webinar is for. A webinar is to get you excited about the learning and then to entice you to want to learn more. You can always provide links afterwards. You can always, recommend resources, have follow-up activities so they really do get to learn the content. But here, of course, a lot of us might have a textbook we teach with, and that's where they're going to do a lot of reading. When you have a webinar, it's to highlight key points, get them to pay attention to certain parts. And so less is more. Usually the rule is one idea per slide. So the main idea of this slide, even though, we have a couple of points here, but the main idea of this slide would be designing engaging slides, how to design slides. That would be the key idea here. And then we are offering some tips here. And so that's what you should do when you are designing different slides. You don't want to put a lot of information. Instead, focus on a key idea and the best visual for that. Use high quality images. I use Pixabay. I definitely recommend that you put the safety feature. I don't necessarily like students to use Pixabay, so I will let you know that just because they have questionable images that come up in the search. I prefer instead, and I've said that in the past, that a lot of online web tools designed for students, such as Bunsy, have Pixabay within it, and that's a better way for students to be able to get high quality images. There's also PicWizard, and PicWizard I haven't ran into anything questionable. I think the search options are way better on Pixabay, so pretty much every single picture I get, unless it says Flickr, is from Pixabay. And then it's also important to be creative. And there's a lot of, if you go to slideshare.com, there's tons of slide presentations that will really walk you through the process of designing, of design elements in slides. I don't follow them necessarily all the time, but I do try some of the tricks. It usually depends on how much time I have. A lot of times, especially with these webinars, we only have 30 minutes. And so it's not a lot of time to be able to try those, but they have some really, really great tips for designing slides. And that one is slideshare.net, and you can just say PowerPoint presentations or presentation design. So as I mentioned earlier, I use Pixabay. There's also PicWizard. And there's several more. We've mentioned them in other webinars, and that's why I didn't mention all of them. Most importantly is to exude enthusiasm, and hopefully with a lot of the different, with most of these presentations, you'll be able to hear my voice that I get very excited. I like sharing. I like sharing web tools. I like, showing what's out there and how to better engage our learners. And that's definitely important. When you're teaching, it's really important to be able that the students are able to see you're excited about the information, or you're excited about the content, or you really enjoy teaching it. Because if you don't, then there's no way that they're going to want to be interested if you're not even interested. So I think that's very, very important. I've actually been to presentations where maybe the design wasn't so great, maybe the actual PowerPoint presentation or whatever it wasn't that well designed, but I loved the presentation because the presenter was so dynamic and really passionate about the topic. The other part that I really like as well is um, to invite guest experts. You don't have to be the one, especially if you do this with students more than one time, and this is an ongoing part of your teaching, then invite guest experts. Have them come in, talk to the students. Sometimes guest experts will present and have a presentation, or they don't have to. If you have a guest speaker who's very, very busy, then you can set it up as an interview. And students instead will research the background, look at their website, look at, videos of them in action. And then your students can write down some pertinent interview questions that you can collect ahead of time. Make sure that they relate to the topic. And then once you approve them, then students can ask those questions to the expert when the time comes. And that way the expert doesn't really have to set up anything. That way the expert can just be part of that webinar, and then you can add a few slides about their background and all of that information. And one thing that you can do too to make it more interesting is actually have students be able to ask those questions through the microphone, and then get them set up for that. And that makes it a really, really interesting webinar. It's definitely important to get students to participate and engage them, especially if the webinar is over half an hour, or even within a half an hour. That way students aren't bored, they don't get off task, so you won't know what they're doing at home, obviously, during a webinar. They could be checking their Facebook, they could be texting. There's so many things they could be doing. And to make sure that they're constantly paying attention, it's good to get them to participate. One of the easiest ways, and some of you are very adept at webinars, or you have a lot of experience, or you've presented webinars. And one worry that a lot of webinar hosts have is the bandwidth. And so if you do something too engaging, then a lot of times it might make the system crash, or you might have technical difficulties. And that can actually be bad for a webinar, because especially if you're recording that webinar, then you'll have to go back, edit, and that takes a really long time. So one tip that I'd like to share is, when you do make it engaging, try very low tech ideas at the beginning, and all the high tech ideas, or the ones that you think are more at risk to have technical difficulties, try those towards the end. So that way, at least you get the majority of the presentation running pretty smoothly. So I'm going to show you some ones that a lot of technical difficulties won't happen. And one of them is by starting with the statement, just simply putting a few words, and then having students complete that, or having participants complete that. So your English language learners would see this, or in this case, we have you all are teachers, so you would have to complete this statement. What do you believe successful students do? Successful students do what? And then each of you would put that in the chat box, what you believe successful students do. you might say they study. They're very organized. I mean, there's lots of different ideas for that. Another way, and we had that much earlier within this webinar, is a poll. And so a lot of times you can just open up the polling platform. You can actually have a poll come on screen, and then have in different platforms, they allow different types of, checking different types of options. And so if we were to have this poll, it would actually come out and you could choose, one of these options. I've only attended webinars. I have presented at least less than 5 webinars. I've presented over 5. And then we would all get to see that live, the numbers coming up, and then we could discuss that. The other way is through, and we saw that as well, with this particular platform, Adobe Connect, we have at the very, very top a little man raising his hand. And if you use the drop down arrow, that's where you get the different options. A lot of times, a lot of these platforms have emojis, and that's a really fun way to engage learners. That's a great way for learners. For example, let's say you're studying a text and you want learners to point out areas that they disagree, or areas that or they're against, or that they're that's a con. And so if you can pause, and then you can ask students, whether they how do they feel about the particular information you're sharing, or about the scene, or about what the character does. And emojis can be a way for everyone to see what they feel about that particular scene, or what that character's decision was. In Adobe Connect, they have laughter. So that's the emoji they have there. So you can express laughing. There's a lot of different whiteboard activities as well. When I used to present with EduBlogs, this is one that Joe Hart used to have us do all the time. And I thought it was really, really wonderful, especially if you have an international audience. When we teach English language learners, some of us may teach, even if it's in the same country, we may teach English language learners from that originated from different countries. And that's actually been my experience most of the time, even when I've taught abroad. And so you would be able to do something um, like this, where you can say, okay, where did you come from? And, put where you were born. So there's a lot of different ways to use this map option. And students, they choose, you allow them for a short period of time to use whiteboard tools. And then they're able to go ahead and they're able to choose, a point in the map that they where they're from, or where they came. I think you might be able to use, I'm not sure if you're able to use the ones that are in here. The time is short, so I think I just took it off. And then there are pros and cons. So you can do a lot of different types of graphic organizers. For example, right now we're doing comparison and contrast with my learners. And so a Venn diagram would be very good. There's this pros and cons list of students, and these can always be like intro activities and ways to kind of wrap up the session, or gain to see where students are at, what they know. And then all of the students are able to put it on as once. Now, the trick is when you don't want to necessarily have this for more than like 20 or 30 students, because everybody's writing on the board. It gets very messy. And it's going to be messy. Students are not, they don't have a lot of practice with the tools. And that's okay, because you can always, it'll clear up. So the great part about different webinar platforms is they allow you to allow students to use the drawing tools for a specific amount of time, and then you can quickly just stop it, to where students, when you see that it's getting out of hand, then you can go ahead and you can you can take those tools away pretty fast. And that's one way to manage it. There's also pass the mic activities, and that can be where you have students share ideas. In this case, if you had ideas to share, then I would have you raise your hand, and then I could ask, do any of you have any examples? Or I could call on a few students. Now, there are different ways to do this. When you pass the mic, it's really important in order to limit the technical difficulties. It's important that students run an audio check, that they have that you send them the information to make sure that their technology will support a smooth transition, that they're able to speak. And so that's really important. You might pick, if you do this regularly, and then okay, so Peggy makes a good point. She usually hosts open mic shows, but it's hard to get people to be brave enough to take the mic. And that's actually the same experience I have with students. So what I tend to do is to choose a couple of students that it's usually over material we've gone through the week. I've seen their activities in class and ask them to share. And each webinar, new students will share. And this way, the great thing about that is that then you can limit the amount, but also you can get students to prepare ahead of time and to also check their audio settings, and that way there's less technical difficulties. Plus, the other part is we have a limited amount of time, so it's not likely that everyone gets to share, which is why we have polls, why we have drawing, because then everybody gets to participate and engage that way, and that doesn't take a lot of time. And ultimately, if you have or host ongoing webinars to teach your students, then then you want them to be brave enough at some point after you've done a few and modeled and given them a good example of what to do, to have students lead their own webinar and teach the content. You can make it very short. So it could be where they only do 5-minute presentations. Maybe you have a group of them. Maybe they do a panel discussion instead, where 3 or 4 of them present on an idea or answer questions that they're experts with. So there's a lot of ways that you can do this. It's not that it doesn't have to be like this, where you have me presenting or one person presenting and it's a presentation. There are a lot of ways to get students to present, and they don't even have to have a presentation. And then very important is the follow-up. After the webinar takes place, there's several ways to follow up. And also it's important to get the information out to students. Some students may have not caught everything. They may have had technical difficulties. They may have had an emergency arise. And so sharing the recording is really important, and deciding, how you're going to get them that recording. Evaluations, if you continue to have webinars, you might ask students during an evaluation, what they would like to do, or what was their favorite engaging activity, or what was what you could work on, what they would like to see. And so evaluations are a great way to keep improving the learning experience and get input from students. You can follow up on a discussion forum after the webinar. There can be a question on the LMS or in class, and have students respond to what was, the content and what they thought about it. And so there's definitely a lot of ways you can do that. And then there are exit tickets, and exit tickets are basically very simple. It usually takes students about 5 minutes. It's something like, okay, 3 points or 3 takeaways you learned from the webinar, and then students complete that, and then they send that to you. So there's a lot of different ways to do exit tickets. And that's it. So those are the top ideas for teaching with webinars. Like I said, in this webinar, I didn't mention any platforms. I know Peggy George shared about Steve Hargadon, where anyone can use that webinar platform for free. Teachers to present. Classroom 20 is always looking for presenters, and so these are great ways to be able to practice if you're a teacher and you want to teach with webinars, but maybe you're a little shy, or maybe you would like to um, get some practice presenting before you do this in front of students. And so those are really great ways to be able to host your own webinar and to be able to present among teachers who can give you some positive feedback and constructive feedback as well. You can find the resources here. And of course, we will be sharing the recording at all of our social networks, which is at